Hello, CALBO community. Thank you for joining me for this legislative briefing that's going to outline the final actions of 2025. My name is Matt Wheeler. If you're not familiar with me, I serve as Executive Director of California Building Officials. It's my job to be the point of contact to state legislative offices as well as administrative and regulatory offices at the state level to represent local building departments and CALBO's best interests. With that, I wanted to just share a few details with you in what we found in 2025 when it came to state legislation. I have to give a shout out to the great CALBO Legislative Committee. We analyzed over 3,000 pieces of legislation this year. It might be my job to convey our opinion to state entities, but I can't do it if I don't have these great representatives from the CALBO membership helping me to understand the impacts that would be realized at the local level with a lot of these individual pieces of legislation. So thank you to the Legislative Committee. With that, I'm going to go over a few things today. I'm going to go over the legislative calendar so that we're all clear on where we find ourselves, ending the first year of a two-year cycle. I'm going to talk about the 2025 outcomes, what actually came out of 2025. And then I'm going to talk about some of our victories. I think it's really important to remember that, there's a few bills that we don't really care for that made it through. We had a lot of victories. We worked really hard this year, and we have a lot of things to be proud of as CALBO. So I'm going to share those with you, as well as talk about a few of the bills that still could come back next year. And then we'll wrap it all up. So we're going into the 2026 year, which is the second year of a two-year session. So as a reminder, at the state legislative level, we have a full-time government. And so the two-year session was called to order on December 1st of 2024. So the governor just finished up on October the 12th, his signing deadline for the first year. So all the bills that are going to come out in 2025 have been signed or acted upon by Governor Newsom, which means the next deadline to come down the pike is going to be February 20th, 2026, which is the new bill introduction deadline. So that means all of the bills, the new ideas, the proposals, they have to be introduced by February 20th coming up, and then we'll know what else is going to be on the horizon for 2026. Following that deadline, we'll go through another series of deadlines, which is the legislative process, until finally Governor Newsom has until September the 30th of 2026 to act upon everything that's going to come out through this process. Now, it's an election year next year, and so this is Governor Newsom's final year in office. And so without a doubt, we will be busy representing local government and CALBO's best interests. So with that, here's a summary of the bills that I'm going to go over that were 2025 outcomes. There's 6 that I'm going to dive into. If you've been watching these videos, none of these are going to be a surprise to you. I've already talked about them, and of course, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite, yes, sarcasm, AB 306. But I'm going to go into detail now that that is enforceable and talk a little bit about it to come. So the first bill I want to talk to you about that does become effective January the 1st is AB 253. Now, this is a bill CALBO opposed from the very beginning. Let me start by saying, if you weren't clear, 2025 was just the year of housing. It was as if 120 elected officials kind of woke up and said, oh, we have housing problems in California. We have a shortage. We have affordability issues. There's just all kinds of problems associated with housing. And so there were many bills this last round that pointed back to us as local government that said, you're not acting fast enough, you're not inspecting quick enough, there's too much red tape and bureaucracy, whatever it may be. There was a lot of pointing back to us. And so we're going to talk about a lot of the proposals that came out that were fine. You're part of the problem, local government. Here's what we think you should be doing to help stimulate housing production and supply. So this one is one of those. It came out of an assembly member in the San Diego area's office. It was entitled the California Residential Private Permitting Review Act. And it was somewhat of an extension. If you're familiar with AB 1332 of 2023, it's the one that created the pre-approved set of plans for ADU construction. So this took a bit of a page out of that playbook and said that local government will have to develop and post a fee schedule. But if any plan check takes longer than 30 days, per our own timeline and schedule, this would allow an applicant to go out and self-select a third-party plan check firm. Now, our concern with this is obviously we don't like to be undermined. We don't like control leaving our building departments, but our bigger concern was consumer protection. We said, look, a consumer doesn't know that there's local amendments. A consumer doesn't necessarily understand that they need to pick somebody from a third-party plan check firm that has familiarity not just with their project, but also the local government that it's going to be submitted to for final approval. With that, we had suggested what some other states do, successes in Utah and Tennessee, where there's a statewide list. And the assembly member said, absolutely not. That's collusion. We don't think a building department should be telling homeowners who they should be working with. Okay, we disagree. We work really well with a lot of third parties. You're part of our fabric. You're probably watching this video. So with that, we weren't able to come to consensus, and ultimately, this bill is effective as of January 1. Now, we understand the intent. The intent is stated to accelerate housing permits and construction. We get it. But we had some pretty big problems with this bill. And, unfortunately, despite our opposition, it is effective January 1. That's AB 253. Another bill that we opposed from the very beginning was AB 671, also becoming effective on January 1. Now, what this one did was it extended the Permit Streamlining Act to accelerate restaurant TI improvements. Okay. Why specific to restaurants? Why should they be different than other forms of businesses? But there was a very active lobby on behalf of quote unquote small business and restaurants that said, restaurant TIs should be simple and it should be easy to streamline a permit. And so it allows a permit applicant to self-select what is defined as a qualified professional designer to certify their own plans. It requires us to act within 20 days or the permit is automatically approved. Again, there were a lot of inconsistencies in this bill, despite our very best efforts. This one is effective January 1. That's AB 671. Now, this is a bit of a win for us. I've been talking about AB 1308 all year. And this bill started in a very different form, which I'll explain to you. And some amendments were finally accepted by Assemblymember Hoover that allowed us to go neutral. So what that means is we opposed the bill, but we said, look, we think there's room for negotiation here. If you were willing to do this, we can't support your bill, but we would at least remove our opposition. So what AB 1308 does is it requires residential inspections to be completed within 10 days after receiving a notice of permitted work completion. So I hear you. You're probably saying, I do this overnight. I do same day inspections. I do next day inspections. On average, probably it's 2 to 4 days in California. But like I said earlier, there's a bit of the finger pointing to where we as local government aren't acting fast enough. And so that's one of the major problems as to why housing supply is as low as it is. Again, I'm explaining the theory, not the reality. So this bill, it states that if we don't act within that 10-day timeline, that we're in violation of the Housing Accountability Act and punitive action can be taken against the local jurisdiction. Now, this is strictly limited to residential construction, only residential construction, 10 units or less. And then it is not applicable to remodels. So that pleases us too when we're really looking at the scope of the permits that probably most of us are dealing with. Now, let me kind of explain where the bill started. The original version of the bill, which we opposed, said that anytime that our timeline would have gone over 30 days, it would have been that self-selected private third party that would be allowed to come in to inspect and ensure compliance. We were able to change it from that to the 10-day timeline window. So we see that as a pretty significant victory, probably not going to cause a lot of heartburn for our members. Ultimately, we never like to be undermined or have control taken away from us, but this was a win, at least as we saw it. Now, here it is, AB 306. We've been talking about this for months now. Let me just do a real quick reminder of where we started and where we ended. AB 306 was introduced in January, and it originally froze residential building standards across the board for 6 years. So between January and June, the bill was amended 5 different times. CALBO was actively engaged with the original author, ICC, NFPA, IAPMO, and stating how there were major concerns if this bill were to be implemented. There were definitions that were incorrect. There were, the statute didn't necessarily connect to the codes that we enforce. And so we were trying to work out a lot of details, but literally overnight on June the 30th, the provisions of AB 306 that we were working on got inserted into a 212-page budget trailer bill and then signed as part of the state budget by Governor Newsom and immediately became effective. So the bill that we were working on no longer need to work on it because it became state law literally overnight. Now, with that, there were some successes in where the bill started and where it ultimately was signed. What it generally states is from October 1st, which is already passed, to June the 1st of 2031, local cities and counties can't modify residential building standards except under very specific circumstances. If you had your packages filed and effective by September 30th, deadline's passed. So if that didn't happen, this applies and usurps it. If the local residential standards are relative to home hardening, interestingly enough, nowhere in statute or code was home hardening or wildfire mitigation, which is what it is, defined clearly, or in times of declared emergency. But the bright side is originally the entire triennial cycle was going to be frozen for 6 years. And what this did is it froze the residential standards at the local level, but at least enabled the moving forward of the 2025 and the 2028 versions of the state codes and the California code adoptions. Now, with that, there was a permanent change that included a limited intervening cycle, which means not just for 6 years, permanently. That intervening cycle is going to be limited to editorial changes, emergency standards, incorporation of errata from the model codes, or Chapter 7A and the WUI provisions. Now, the home builders, we worked very closely and collaboratively with CBIA. They supported this bill. And I'm going to talk about what they got out of it, at least in our opinion, from this provision that extends the approval of 10 years for residential plans. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail here in a second. Now, as a reminder, this bill does not apply to commercial. So there are now going to be 2 separate codes to enforce because this only applies to residential. We had until September the 30th to adopt and implement local amendments. Now that deadline has passed, and so locals will have to wait until June of 2031, except under the circumstances I just explained. So with that, I'm really grateful to our friends and colleagues over at the Building Standards Commission. They have been wonderful partners in realizing that we have a lot of questions. This bill got signed, kind of under their nose as well. And so they've been trying to help us with understanding intent behind some of the provisions within this bill. So they put out a great information bulletin. It was issued on September the 22nd. I'm guessing you have seen it. If you haven't, it's available on their website, and I included the website right there. Go look it up. What it does is it gives us guidance. It says, here's how the provisions as we see it, as the Building Standards Commission, should apply and be interpreted. So AB 130, like I mentioned, had a lot of loosely defined terms. For instance, it limited scope of residential construction, but there's no clear definition of what residential construction is. So the interpretation from the BSC is that that AB 130 applies to all R occupancies. So that gives us some parameters. Also within the bill, there was no definition of home hardening. We understand what it is, but there was no actual definition. So the Building Standards Commission said, we don't have that definition to to point to. But luckily, on just October the 15th, the state fire marshal, through their emergency rulemaking package, were able to include a definition of home hardening. So now we have that. We have something to work from. Now, I brought up that model home provision. So we understand what the bill says. It says that the building standards in effect at the time of an application of a building permit is accepted and then approved. But the question was, when does that clock start? Well, that was a good question. And so CBIA and CALBO agree that it's the code that was in place at the time of the approval. So that could include the 2022 version of the California codes. And then from there, if that was the code that was in place at the time of the approval, then 10 years from that date. So the day of the approval is when the 10-year clock starts for these model homes. Now, that is our interpretation of the bill as CBIA and CALBO. Let's make it abundantly clear, when in doubt or when in question, please consult your city attorney, your legal counsel, or whoever can make this applicable and clear for your local community. Another bill that was also signed as part of AB 130 was AB 750. Now, this is the bill that was requiring all local jurisdictions to inspect homeless shelters annually. Now, we were fully engaged with the author's office, Assemblywoman Quirk Silva, and we opposed the bill, but we were working on clarifying language. There were a lot of elements of AB 750 that concerned us. There was also some redundancy. We started by saying, aren't fire departments already doing this? There was disagreement, and so we had submitted some amendments, and literally we submitted them one day, and the next day this bill became state law as part of the budget package, just like AB 306. So now enforceable. Local jurisdictions now have to inspect all homeless shelters annually. And then on top of that, we have to compile an annual report, and the bill specifies what that looks like. You can find it in AB 130, that has data of the complaints received and violations assessed at the local level. And so there's some teeth in that to state that if, violations assessed by the locals, that state funding for shelters can be withheld if the shelter doesn't comply with the applicable health and safety codes and correct the violation. So this is enforceable. Now, with that, that's a lot. 2025, like I said, was very, very, very active, but we also have to look at our successes. We also have to sit down and go, we worked hard. We represented. We came in and said, hey, this is why this is a bad bill, or hey, this is how we see your idea. We see what you're looking to do, legislator, but you're ultimately not going to get what you want here. So if we can amend it, maybe we can get you better to your policy goal. And so we had a lot of victories too. I want to share these 6 bills with you and talk about kind of the victories of how we were able to take something and either get rid of it altogether or at least make it palpable for us at the local level. I already shared with you AB 1308. Let me share with you AB 339. Now, AB 339 is a big bill. This was probably the highest priority for local government in California. The idea had been proposed before, but this year it was signed by the governor and is effective January 1st. What it did was it required the notification of local organized labor groups anytime an RFP was to be released. So if there was work that was going to be outsourced from a local jurisdiction, instead of going to a third party, this bill said it needed to be first offered up to local labor within a city or county. Obviously, the CALBO community and local building departments do a lot of work with third parties. They're an essential part of our community and enable us to do our jobs effectively and efficiently. And so we were able to say, look, when it comes to this type of work, it's very specialized. And so we offered an amendment package, which was accepted, that exempts third-party contracts related to the planning, design, administration, oversight, review, or delivery of public works, residential, commercial, or industrial buildings, or infrastructure relative to codes. That's a huge win for us. We were really able to not just promote our best interests, but say, do you see how the work we do is so specialized that it can't just be kept in-house, we really need that specialized expertise that comes in from third parties. And so this was a huge win for us. Now, that doesn't mean some of the folks a few pay grades above us aren't having to deal with some of the provisions and probably not liking AB 339, but at least in our local building departments, it's a little more palpable than where it started. Another bill that at least became a 2-year bill. I've been talking about AB 557, which would expand the existing California factory-built housing law. The idea being if, we can fast track, we can take this law and expand it, we can expedite housing supply. So what it would do is it would remove inspection and enforcement from locals to fast track. And in doing that, it would allow HCD at the state level to have a single approval without oversight prior to occupancy being allowed under the bill. So we had big concerns with this one. Now you might be saying, factory-built housing, that's not really a thing in my community. Factory-built construction in general isn't really a thing in my community. But our bigger concern is that this is a new and growing construction trend. And if it were able to become faster, quicker, efficient, more cost-effective, and we had already given up our control at the local level, what's that going to look like as this becomes more predominant? And so we were concerned. We didn't just want to cede our control. So luckily, we worked with the Senate Housing Committee, and they said, look, you've got an idea here. Maybe there's some merit to it, but Assemblymember McKinnon, why don't you make it a study bill? And we'll take a look at it. We won't make it law, but we'll have a study chartered where we can look more into this practice and see if it has teeth. She said no. She said absolutely not. My bill has merit, and I would rather make it a 2-year bill and work on it into 2026 than take away the teeth that are within it. So this is a 2-year bill. It'll come up again next year. We will continue to work on it. As it's written right now, will continue to be opposed, but something that I'll be talking about in 2026. Another 2-year bill, this one we really liked, was SB 84. And this was relative to construction-related accessibility claims. And basically stated that, if there was an accessibility claim for specified businesses and employers, small business, a letter would have to be sent first by the claimant, which would then outline the violation, and then the defendant would have 120 days to correct the violation. Not 120 ways, that'd be a different story. But, basically let's give the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that the business owner didn't realize that they weren't complying. They want to do the right thing and comply, but give them the time to comply and fix the violation. From the CALBO standpoint, we saw this as really encouraging accessibility compliance. Instead of just suing and maybe that money never goes back to correcting the violation in the first place, now it's going to give that business the opportunity to correct it and make their business more accessible. So we saw this as a good sense bill. It got stalled in the Assembly Judiciary Committee. So that means it made it out of the Senate, made it over to the Assembly, and it's now in a policy committee, and it's still waiting action and vetting. So it didn't move forward in 2025, but it's still an active bill that we'll be talking about in 2026. Another one along these lines was AB6, and I've been talking about this one quite a bit. This is from that same Assembly member Ward out of San Diego that had a lot of housing conversations this year. And this would have required HCD to convene a working group by the end of next year that would assess the current definition of multifamily. From there, a report would be compiled back to the governor and the state legislature following the work of the work group. So you may be saying, it's a work group. Let's talk about it. Let's look at it. Maybe if we expand the definition of multifamily, we can, work on housing supply and have more units constructed quicker. But we said, whoa, 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 whoa. This isn't a place for state legislation. This is something that needs to be handled at the model code level. And so we pushed back and said, no, let's wait. So with that, the bill is, you see my little bill there as my graphic. It was held under submission. And what this means is that the bill didn't leave the suspense file. And so for all intents and purposes, this bill is dead and won't be acted upon in 2026. Now, it could. It could come back, it could be resurrected, it could be amended, it could be reintroduced. There's lots of different ways that this bill could become a conversation again in 2026. But right now, as of today, AB6 is not moving forward, and that is a win for the CALBO community. Another bill very much along these lines is AB 1206. This came to us out of the Pasadena area and was in response to the January wildfires in the LA area. Essentially, you had a bunch of elected leaders in that area that said, look, my community has all this devastation and we want to rebuild as quick as possible. So what this would have done is it would have required locals to create pre-approved plans for single family and multifamily residential construction projects. And so we would have to pre-approve a plan and then avail them online. That would be, something that, someone could come in, take the plans, and just have the pre-approval, similar to the ADU legislation of a few years ago. Now, we said there's a lot of problems with this, particularly with multifamily. And with that, if we would have allowed it, we would have to approve it within 30 days. I'm very pleased to say that this was held on suspense and is not moving forward, at least at this time. Like I said, it could be resurrected, it could become something else. You never know. But as of now, AB 1206 is no longer active. One more that also got held on suspense. Again, you see my little bill there. You probably remember the solar app legislation that required automatic permitting. So Senator Wiener out of the San Francisco area said, well, why can't we take that same idea of automatic permitting and apply it to residential heat pumps? That's a simple action. It shouldn't require, a permit, or, we shouldn't be paying for this. And it's such a simple installation. And we said, whoa, 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 maybe some of them are, but not all of them are. And so automatic permitting is a really dangerous and slippery slope. And so we oppose this pretty heavily. I'm very pleased to say that it was held back in the legislature and is not an active bill either. Wow. 2025 has indeed been a year, and I wanted to share those details with you, not just of what 2025 looked like, but kind of what we're already working on for 2026. As bills are introduced, the legislative committee will be meeting and looking at the new ones that are coming out. And so I like to remind everybody that we keep a resource on calbo.org, which is our legislative tracking. It's available to everybody. It's kept up in current real time. And so anytime you go, hey, I remember watching that video from that Matt guy and he was talking about this bill, you don't remember it, you can go there and you can probably find it really quickly. It's also a cheat sheet. If you want to see what CALBO is working on, if you're an industry professional, if you're, the ledge chair for your chapter, whatever it may be, please use this resource because we have it there for you to be available. I wouldn't be a good executive director if I didn't plug my CALBO events, and we are already working on the 2026 events. Our 64th annual business meeting will take place in the Bay Area in Santa Clara, April the 12th to the 16th. You can look for that registration to be available, probably around the holiday season. And then we've got Ed Week North that'll be back in Burlingame in the Bay Area, September 28th to October 1st, and then back down south in the Orange County area in Costa Mesa, October 26th to 29th. We're returning to the venues we've been to before. You can expect that it will likely be virtual and in person. We're working on those details right now, but save the date. Here they are. With that, I know that's a lot of information I just shared with you, and hopefully it was of value to you. I would really like to take a moment to thank you for the work you do every day at the local level and all that you do to make CALBO what CALBO is and to safeguard our communities. 2025 has been a year, but we've had a lot of successes to look back upon. And so I appreciate you sharing those with me. And hopefully this video and briefing was of value to you as you're trying to figure out how to keep your building department current, up-to-date, compliant, and ready for what's to come in 2026. I look forward to sharing more videos with you along these lines, and as bills are introduced, you can expect to see more of them. Thank you again for your time and appreciate your attention. Take care.